The HOA thought they could bully Sarah into moving her vintage RV. But when they showed up to tow it away, they got the shock of their lives. She was the city's zoning officer. Now, Sarah's fighting back, and it's about to get personal. This is the story of one woman taking on her community's corruption, no matter the cost. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. The vintage Airstream gleamed in the morning sun, but she wasn't admiring its retro charm. Not today. She'd fought for months to keep her beloved RV parked in her driveway, but the relentless HOA board had finally issued their final warning. Tow it within 48 hours or face escalating fines. "Over my dead body," she muttered, jaw clenched. Sarah had joined the HOA hoping to make positive changes, but the entrenched board had shot down every one of her proposals. Now, they were abusing their power, using petty rules to harass her. Well, she wasn't going down without a fight. Grabbing her briefcase, Sarah marched out the front door, every step fueled by righteous fury. She'd show them who they were messing with. As she approached the community gates, Sarah spotted the tow truck idling just beyond. Two burly men in HOA polo shirts stood guard, clipboards in hand. "Excuse me," she called out, voice laced with feigned politeness. "What seems to be the problem, gentlemen?" The men exchanged a glance. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to remove that RV from your property. It's in violation of the HOA code." Sarah held up a hand. "I see. Well, before you proceed, I think you should know I'm the city's zoning officer." Their jaws dropped. You're what?" "The zoning officer." Sarah flashed her badge. "Which means I'm very familiar with the local ordinances. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that my RV is well within the legal limits." One of the men shifted uncomfortably. "But the HOA." "The HOA has no authority to supersede city zoning laws." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I suggest you two take your tow truck and leave. Now." The men glanced at each other, then hastily climbed back into the truck and peeled out of the community. Sarah watched them go, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. Round one to her. But she knew this was just the beginning. The HOA board wasn't going to take this lying down. They were a vindictive bunch, and they would stop at nothing to get their way. Sarah sighed and headed back inside, already mentally preparing for the onslaught. She had a feeling her troubles with the HOA were far from over. The sound of her doorbell jolted Sarah from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. 9 a.m. on the dot. Right on schedule. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find the entire HOA board standing on her doorstep, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. "Good morning," Sarah said, feigning innocence. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" The HOA president, a stern-faced woman named Gladys, stepped forward. "Sarah, we need to have a talk. About that little stunt you pulled with the tow truck." "Stunt?" Sarah arched an eyebrow. "I'm not sure I know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with us." Glady's eyes narrowed. "You flashed your badge and scared off our guys. That's abuse of power, and we won't stand for it." Sarah crossed her arms. "I was simply exercising my rights as a homeowner and a city official. Your tow truck was in violation of local zoning laws." "Local zoning laws?" Gladys scoffed. "This is an HOA community. We have our own set of rules, and that RV is not welcome here." "Really?" Sarah tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Because I distinctly remember reviewing the HOA covenants when I moved in, and I don't recall any restrictions on recreational vehicles." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Clearly, they hadn't expected Sarah to be so well-versed in the finer points of HOA law. Glady's lips thinned into a tight line. "Be that as it may, we still don't want that eyesore parked in your driveway. It's an eyesore, and it's bringing down property values." "Eyesore? Huh?" Sarah's gaze hardened. "Well, I happen to think it's a beautifully restored vintage Airstream. But if you have a problem with it, I suggest you take it up with the City Planning Commission. I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear about your attempts to circumvent local zoning regulations. Glady's face flushed with anger. Are you threatening us? Not at all. Sarah's expression was serene. I'm simply reminding you of the proper channels to address your concerns. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some work to do. Without another word, she closed the door in their faces, leaving the HOA board to seethe on her doorstep. Sarah leaned against the door, letting out a long, slow breath. The first round had gone to her, but she knew the war was far from over. The HOA would be back, and they would be ruthless. She needed to be ready. Over the next few days, Sarah's phone rang off the hook. The HOA board members were calling her constantly, demanding she remove the RV or face escalating fines and legal action. But Sarah remained steadfast. She knew her rights, and she wasn't about to back down. I'm sorry, Glades, but as I've said before, my RV is in full compliance with local zoning laws, she replied calmly, for the umpteenth time. If you have an issue with it, I suggest you take it up with the City Planning Commission. Glady's voice on the other end of the line grew shrill with frustration. This is an HOA community, Sarah. We have our own rules, and you're blatantly disregarding them. Actually, Glades, the HOA covenants don't supersede local zoning regulations, Sarah pointed out. So unless you can show me a specific ordinance that prohibits recreational vehicles, I'm well within my rights to keep my RV parked here. There was a long pause, and Sarah could almost hear the steam coming out of Glady's ears. This isn't over, Sarah. We're going to fight this tooth and nail. I wouldn't expect anything less, Sarah replied evenly. But I'll be ready. With that, she hung up, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. The HOA was clearly getting desperate, and that was a good sign. It meant they were starting to realize they were up against a formidable opponent. Sarah knew she needed to stay one step ahead of them, though. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily, and she needed to be prepared for their next move. As she stared out the window at her beloved Airstream, a plan began to form in her mind. If the HOA wanted a fight, she was more than happy to give them one. But this time, she was going to be the one setting the terms. Grabbing her laptop, Sarah began researching the city's zoning laws, looking for any loopholes or gray areas that she could exploit. She also started compiling a dossier on the HOA board members, digging into their backgrounds and any potential conflicts of interest. It was time to go on the offensive. Sarah was done playing defense. Now, she was going to take the fight to the HOA. And she had a feeling that they were in for the fight of their lives. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent the better part of the night poring over city zoning laws and HOA regulations, and she was confident that she had the ammunition she needed to take on the relentless HOA board. As she sipped her coffee, she glanced out the window at her beloved Airstream, gleaming in the morning sun. It wasn't just a vehicle to her. It was a symbol of her independence, her free spirit. And she wasn't about to let a bunch of power-hungry HOA members take that away from her. Determined, Sarah headed to City Hall, her briefcase in hand. She had a meeting scheduled with the head of the Planning Commission, and she was determined to make her case. Sarah, what can I do for you? The commissioner, a kindly older man named Mr. Simmons, greeted her with a warm smile. Mr. Simmons, I need your help, Sarah said, cutting straight to the chase. The HOA in my community is trying to force me to remove my RV, and they're using some questionable tactics to do it. Mr. Simmons frowned. That doesn't sound right. The HOA should be working within the bounds of local zoning laws. That's exactly the problem, Sarah explained. They're trying to circumvent those laws, and they're using their position of power to bully me. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. I've done my research, and I believe I have a strong case to challenge their actions. For the next hour, Sarah laid out her argument, citing specific zoning codes and pointing out the HOA's various missteps. Mr. Simmons listened intently, nodding in agreement at key points. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Sarah, you've made a very compelling case. I have to say, I'm impressed by your tenacity and attention to detail." Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Does that mean you'll help me?" Mr. Simmons smiled. "Absolutely. I'll have my team look into this immediately, and we'll be sure to put the HOA in their place." Sarah breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. I really appreciate your support." "No need to thank me," the commissioner replied. "It's our job to ensure that the city's zoning laws are being upheld, regardless of who's trying to circumvent them." As Sarah left City Hall, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The HOA had clearly underestimated her, and now they were about to face the full force of the city's planning commission. This was just the beginning, she knew. The battle was far from over, but she was more determined than ever to win. After all, she had the law on her side. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Sarah. Word of her showdown with the HOA had spread like wildfire through the community, and she found herself the center of attention, both positive and negative. On one hand, she had neighbors coming up to her, offering their support and thanking her for standing up to the tyrannical HOA board. They were fed up with the constant harassment and power tripping, and they were glad to see someone finally fighting back. On the other hand, Gladys and the rest of the HOA board were in full attack mode. They had hired a high-powered attorney and were threatening to take Sarah to court over her blatant disregard for their rules and regulations. But Sarah remained undaunted. She knew she had the law on her side, and she was determined to use it to her advantage. One afternoon, as she was working in her home office, her phone rang. It was Mr. Simmons from the Planning Commission. "Sarah, I've got some news for you," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of excitement. "We've been digging into the HOA's activities, and it turns out they've been violating all kinds of zoning codes and city ordinances." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. "Go on." "It seems the HOA has been funneling money into a slush fund to bribe city officials and influence zoning decisions," Mr. Simmons continued. "We've also uncovered evidence of them illegally demolishing historic properties to make way for new developments." Sarah's eyes widened. "Wow, that's huge." "It is," Mr. Simmons confirmed. "And we're not done yet. We're going to be launching a full-scale investigation into the HOA's activities, and we want you to be a key witness." Sarah felt a sense of both dread and triumph. "Of course, Mr. Simmons. Anything I can do to help." "Excellent." She could hear the smile in his voice. "I'll be in touch with the details. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing, standing up to those HOA bullies. You're making a real difference in this community." As Sarah hung up the phone, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had always known that the HOA was up to no good, but she had never imagined the extent of their corruption. Now, with the full force of the city's planning commission behind her, she was more determined than ever to take them down. The gloves were off, and the stakes had just been raised. This was going to be an all-out war. The news of the Planning Commission's investigation into the HOA's shady activities spread like wildfire through the community. Suddenly, Sarah found herself at the center of a media frenzy, with reporters clamoring for interviews and neighbors stopping her on the street to offer their support. Gladys and the rest of the HOA board, on the other hand, were in full damage control mode. They held an emergency meeting, hastily hiring a team of high-powered lawyers to try and shut down the investigation. But Sarah was one step ahead of them. With the full support of the Planning Commission, she had gone on the offensive, using her position as a city official to dig even deeper into the HOA's misdeeds. "They've been embezzling funds, using the HOA's money to line their own pockets," she told a local news reporter, her voice steady and confident. "And they've been using their influence to skirt zoning laws and push through development projects that are harmful to the community." The reporter's eyes widened. Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation. Do you have any evidence to back that up? Sarah nodded, her expression grim. Oh, we have plenty of evidence. The Planning Commission has been working around the clock to uncover the full extent of the HOA's corruption. And let me tell you, it's not a pretty picture. The reporter leaned in, sensing a big story. Can you give us any more details? Sarah held up a hand. I'm afraid I can't share too much at this stage, as the investigation is still ongoing. But I can tell you that the Planning Commission is committed to getting to the bottom of this and ensuring that the HOA is held accountable for their actions. As the interview wrapped up, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The HOA had clearly underestimated her, and now they were on the defensive, scrambling to try and salvage their reputation. But Sarah wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily. She knew that the Planning Commission's investigation was just the beginning, and she was determined to see this thing through to the end. The stakes were high, and the pressure was on. But Sarah was more convinced than ever that she was doing the right thing. After all, she was fighting for more than just her own personal victory. She was fighting for the entire community to ensure that the HOA's corrupt and abusive practices were finally brought to light. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah could feel the walls closing in. The HOA had pulled out all the stops, hiring a team of high-powered lawyers to try and shut down the Planning Commission's investigation. But Sarah was undaunted. She knew that the evidence they had uncovered was damning, and she was determined to see this thing through to the end. As the investigation continued, the details of the HOA's corruption began to emerge. It was a tangled web of bribes, backroom deals, and flagrant disregard for the law. The HOA had been using their influence to push through development projects that were clearly in violation of zoning regulations, all while lining their own pockets with the proceeds. They had even gone so far as to demolish historic buildings to make way for their latest pet project. Sarah's stomach turned as she pored over the evidence. She had known that the HOA was corrupt, but she had never imagined the depths of their depravity. And now, as the spotlight of public scrutiny shone brighter and brighter, the HOA was fighting back with everything they had. This is all a witch hunt. Ladies, the HOA president declared in a fiery press conference. Sarah is a disgruntled homeowner who is trying to undermine the legitimate authority of this community. We've done nothing wrong, and we will not be bullied by the City Planning Commission or anyone else. But Sarah knew better. She had the evidence, and she was determined to see justice served. As the investigation dragged on, the pressure only continued to mount. The HOA's lawyers were relentless, filing motion after motion to try and stall the proceedings. And the community itself was divided, with some residents still loyal to the HOA and others rallying behind Sarah. But through it all, Sarah remained steadfast. She knew that she was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was fighting for the integrity of the entire community. And as the final showdown approached, she couldn't help but feel a sense of nervous excitement. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever happened, she was ready. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the final hearing got underway. Sarah sat at the front, her eyes trained on the judge as he listened intently to the arguments from both sides. Glades and the HOA board's lawyers were making a last-ditch effort to discredit the Planning Commission's investigation, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and that Sarah was nothing more than a vindictive homeowner. But Sarah knew better. She had spent months meticulously gathering the proof, and she was confident that the judge would see through the HOA's smoke and mirrors. As the proceedings dragged on, Sarah felt a bead of sweat trickle down her back. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the HOA won, they would likely continue their reign of corruption, unchecked. But if she prevailed, it would be a major victory for the entire community. Finally, the judge raised his hand, silencing the room. I have heard the arguments from both sides, and I must say, I am deeply concerned by the evidence presented here today. Glades stiffened, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. It is clear to me that the HOA has been engaging in a pattern of illegal and unethical behavior, including the misappropriation of funds and the violation of local zoning laws. The judge's gaze swept across the room. I have no choice but to place the HOA under immediate receivership, pending a full investigation and the implementation of new governance protocols. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, but the judge raised his hand again. Furthermore, I am ordering the HOA to cease all operations and remove Ms. Sarah Wilkins' RV from her property immediately. The City Planning Commission will be taking over the management of this community, effective immediately. Sarah felt a surge of triumph as she watched Blady's and the other board members' faces fall. They had been caught red-handed, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. As the judge banged his gavel and adjourned the proceedings, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had fought tooth and nail to expose the HOA's corruption, and in the end, justice had prevailed. Walking out of the courthouse, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding the community's trust and restoring its integrity would be a long and arduous process. But she was ready for the challenge. After all, she was the zoning officer, and she was determined to make sure that this community was run the right way, no matter who stood in her way. As she climbed into her beloved Airstream and fired up the engine, Sarah couldn't help but smile. The HOA had tried to bully her, but in the end, they had underestimated her resolve. And that, she thought, was their biggest mistake of all.